Let's come back attentively. We're looking at the energy of civilization. The energy of civilization is time. In the universe, time is the energy of the universe. But for the cosmos, the source of time is the source of the cosmos. And the source of time is a zero field fertilized by an infinite field. Their complementarity has an entanglement known as love. Now, this is not only an ancient wisdom, it was a wisdom understood by beings similar to us who matured in star systems that were mature before our whole star system was emerged some 4.5 billion years ago. It's not a question of just being ancient, but of primordial. We have now the maturity of civilization within our scalar of wisdom to be able to understand. We need to know what we are doing is almost completely irrelevant to reality. And so we're making excursions into sets of resonance that are amenable to a harmonic analysis. And that harmonic analysis is akin to an expressed appreciation of music. But just as there is a musicology, or there is an understanding of the compositional structuring of music, music itself is what is real. And so our harmonic analysis is not simply to point out the structure of time forms of civilization as a complex time energy. In the universe, time is a single dimension. It's the first dimension. But in civilization, the maturation of time has become triplex, triple, 3 kinds of time, 3 facets of time, which show up in the classical beginning of time forms, where the displacement of a natural cycle of universal time is shifted into a new quality of civilization, not with the emergence of cities. Proto-cities were there long before, in refined, intermixed cultures there were already urban areas. One can look in the news, ancient Erbil was there some 7,000 years ago. Even origins longer. Jericho was there almost 10,000 years ago in origins. The metronome of time forms of civilization is language in its written expression. Writing a language connotates reading a language, meaning that one is able to think beyond the structure of symbolic thought in an integral mode. How is that possible? By not identifying, by not using identification as the metronome of what you are able to write and read. And the first written languages that were, as the saying is in language, in linguistics, the first written languages that were discursive enough to be read, not simply signs that were arranged, but were symbolic in the sense that they were read, was about 4350 BC, about 6,300 plus years ago. That marks a reference wave for the energies of time to now commence to have something which is tripartite beyond the time of the integral universe. Now, there were excursions, largely by dreams, sometimes by seizures of moment, sometimes by the genius of vision before then. But one does not find a written language until that era. And so that is a reference wave. And that reference wave is a reference wave not in a time looking forward to a future, but because that continuum of wherein that reference wave occurs includes, which is a weak word, the reference wave occurs as a time energy in a continuum that goes back to the sourcing out of which time itself emerged in the first place in the universe. Consciousness occurs in an infinite field. It doesn't have a time limitation, but is differential. Gives the fertility to an integral acceptance, a receptivity that understands that with a love, that complementarity is fertile, and that the zeroness is not a zeroness, but is a scalar of receptivity without limit, able to embrace the infinite differential. And so one has a sourcing of a written language that can be read, so that the maturation proceeds in increments of what has been set up as a reference wave, expecting a carrier wave, because it's a reference of that carrier wave. But as one looks at the way in which the physics actually operates, it's not only a carrier wave of energy with a reference wave, but it has an enduring third quality of time In music, it's the undertones to the tone, and then the overtone resonances that make the harmonic, that make the music, make the lyric. And the overtone, the third kind of time, was not able to be characterized until there was the ability to have a quantum mathematics that was refined enough to be able to understand that all of this coming together was not just integrating, but was like an implosive explosion of not a fission like the atomic bomb, which that was, or even the fusion of the hydrogen bomb, which that was, but an explosiveness that the creativity with a capital C now has come into play. And as it comes into play, as we were talking about at the very beginning, 1927, 28. At the time, there were conferences held every several years. They were called the Solvay Conferences of Physics. Belgium, a rich industrialist, was sponsoring them. And at the Solvay Conference, number 5, 1927, a who's who, Einstein, etc. Everyone was there. Dirac, the whole gang was there, including a French prince, Prince de Broglie. And he's the one who connotated, in a paper presented then, the pilot wave, the reference waves, the carrier waves, and the pilot wave. And that the pilot wave in mathematics is known as a soliton. That the soliton carries its energy without diminishing. It does not diminish. It does not have an atrophying. That soliton, pilot wave person, occurs without limitation, without degradation, without impairment. When we look at the high Dharma, we look at the Mahayana refined into the Vajrayana, and at that time, about 400 years after the beginnings of the Vajrayana through the Tantras, through the love complementarity raised to an infinite harmonic, the development of the incarnation, the history and mysticism of the Tulku tradition of Tibet. We talked last week's presentation, about how consciousness is stronger than matter, stronger than the integral structures of just the thought that a symbolic structure, a plan, an understanding would make, way beyond that and way deeper than that. Is this quality of someone, like last presentation showed a photo by Joseph Needham of Hui Nig, the seventh patriarch of Zen Buddhism, in the middle of the 600s, at the same time that Islam took over Alexandria and Egypt in China, because Islam and China are heavily linked together, like Islam and Southern Europe are linked together, especially the Spanish, especially the Southern Spanish in Andalusia, where the genius of the Sufis was raised to a pinnacle that went off the charts with Ibn Arabi. At the very same time that the pinnacle of Jewish understanding, the Jewish tradition, also in the same places at the same time went off the charts with Maimonides. And because the echo was also into France, it went off the charts at the very same time in France that you began to have the realization that there's more to this than we've been told. The pilot waves of Louis de Broglie are persons who are able to understand the time forms of civilization, though they have not been called that previous to the developments that are being presented here. They were understood in various ways, in various languages. For instance, one finds in Ovid's Metamorphoses the 4 ages of man as the 4 metals: gold, silver, copper, and then iron. But if you look closely at Ovid, the Metamorphoses only begins with that because he's in the Roman Empire writing under Augustus Caesar, and he patiently morphs the Metamorphoses so that the 15th, last chapter of the Metamorphoses is all about Pythagoras. He gets down to it. And when it was realized by Augustus what he had done, that he had sneaked in something that not only sabotages the Roman Empire, his principiate, his imperium, but that if he drew attention to Ovid by having him killed, it would make everyone wonder, why was he deserving of being killed? He exiled him to Constantia on the Black Sea in what is today Romania, where no one could speak Latin at all. Ultimate exile. Imperial powers, world orders, always fear losing their energy. They are not afraid of any kind of battles, any kind of engagement whatsoever. They fear what any kind of artificial power source fears, that someone will pull the plug. And it's not until later that they realize that someone already pulled the plug. Not only pulled the plug, but shut off the power supply. Nothing is going to work anymore until a new source of mature understanding of the triple time energies of civilization has become the common knowledge, property, workability of the population on the planet. It can take as long as it needs. It can take as short as it needs. They're not conditions that are laid down. It's actuality that's in play. From here on out into infinity is a continuity. Here's how the Yazidis' origin in Yazid Khalil ibn Yazid. In the name of the Lord, holy and compassionate, this is the story of how Khalid ibn Yazid ibn Muawiyah came into possession of the spiritual riches handed down from Stephanos of Alexandria to Morianos, the aged recluse, as is written in the book of Ghalib, bondsman of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Now Ghalib was Yazid's faithful servant, entrusted with all his master's possessions, and in time, it is said, became faithful servant likewise to Yazid's son Khalid. And the first translation of this into English was 1982. Published in Hanover, New Hampshire. Lee Stobbingen, almost unread. Equally almost unread is this volume by Ian Richard Netton, Muslim Neoplatonists, an introduction to the thought of the Brethren of Purity, the Ikhwan al-Safra. And they were constellated in the Baghdad of Harun al-Rashid, originally in the late 800s, and by the time one gets to the Ikhwan, the Brethren, there was a great maturity that had happened and came into play. Here's how the blurb reads from the cover of the book. The Brethren of Purity, Ikhwan al-Safa, were a group of Arab thinkers who lived in Basra, South Iraq, in the 10th or 11th century AD, the 900s, 1000s. They are as well known in the Arab world as Newton, Hegel, or Marx in the West. They are called themselves the sleepers in the cave of our father Adam. Notice now that they've gone back, not only back to the original Muhammad and that first generation of Islam, going back to Abraham, we are the inheritors of the other 7 sons of Abraham. Not only Ishmael from Hagar, but the 6 sons of Ketubah as well. We're the inheritor of the 7 sons of Abraham. That single self-satisfied patriarchy is a patriarchy of 1/8. We're in the 7/8. But notice that the 7 now not only refers to Abraham, but refers back to Adam. Why? Okay, there's Adam, and then Eve is made out of a rib. Fine. They have 2 sons. One of them kills the other son. Cain goes off into exile. He has descendants. He married somebody outside, a woman outside of that lineage. They have a 3rd son, Seth, one of the great Gnostic Valentinians and then Sethians, that group that came out in the early 2nd century. Seth has to have a wife. She came from the outside too. The outside are all these women who are part of a huge general population, not just this little male patriarchy, but that the female receptivity and inheritance, like the mitochondria DNA, comes from outside of that tradition, so that they call themselves the Ikhwan al-Safa. They're known as the Brethren of Purity, as an ascription to them. They call themselves the sleepers in the cave of our father Adam. We go all the way back to Adam, a description which originates in the Quran. And in the Quran, in that surah, number 33, the legend of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus. Why is that so? Because the 7 sleepers of Ephesus in a cave, when Ephesus was a grand city with a great harbor and everything, it had several hundreds of thousands of people, was ancient, was also the place to where, after the crucifixion resurrection, Mary Magdalene moved herself, not back to Alexandria, didn't stay, never actually lived. When she was a little girl, maybe she lived in Magdala on the Sea of Galilee. After her father became a leper, Simon the leper, he was put in the Valley of the Lepers on the other side of the Mount of Olives, and the family built a new villa there in Bethany, so that they were within walking distance of the father and so forth. It was a cemetery also. That's where Mary Magdalene's older brother Lazarus was put into a tomb and raised from the dead as well. And she was sent to the family business, which was in Tyre on the Mediterranean, which is the ancient colonizing city of the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians colonized Carthage in 800 BC. They colonized what became Marseille in 600 BC. And they went through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and went down African coast as far as the Cameroons and up the Atlantic coast of Portugal, Spain. All of this was done so that by 300 BC they were already one of the great mariners from Marseille of Tyrrhenian impetus and descent, was the first to circumnavigate the British Isles, Ireland, and all the way out past the Faroes to Iceland, to where the sun never set. It was daylight 24 hours a day, 300 some BC. So Lazarus inherited the father's shipping business, trading business, and he took the young sister Mary Magdalene. The older sister Martha was overseeing the house in Bethany, and the mother, and visiting the leper father. And Mary Magdalene was raised under the aegis and protection of her brother Lazarus. And the shipping business went not only from Tyre across the Mediterranean and all the way to Britain. Eventually, Joseph of Arimathea would get to West Britain by the same shipping company. That shipping company had taken Mary Magdalene to Alexandria, now took her to Ephesus. And when she passed away in 57 AD, she was entombed in the cave of the 7 sleepers, what would become the cave of the 7 sleepers. That tomb is still there. And the first person to identify that that was the tomb of Mary Magdalene was a French savant who was raised a Roman Catholic, who had a tremendous psychophysical illness, and when he recovered from that, he had a lifelong interest in the mysticism of Islam. Though he stayed as a Roman Catholic, a French Roman Catholic, he was one of the first French great understanders of the Sufi mysticism of Islam. And he's the one, when he was in Ephesus, when he was in the cave of the 7 sleepers, when he recognized that that surah in the Quran is almost ignored, as Mary Magdalene is ignored in the Christian tradition. He identified the tomb of Mary Magdalene. He was the first to do so. And I've included photos of her tomb. And his name was Louis Massignon. And Louis Massignon was the teacher of Henri Corbin. Henri Corbin lived from 1903 to 1978, and who is the author of all of the great works that began to open up Ibn Arabi and the mysticism of Islam. His two really great books, one is called The Man of Light in Iranian Sufism, and another is called Creative Imagination in the Sufism of Ibn Arabi, published in the Bollingen series, which had previously published another one of Henri Corbin's studies of Islamic wise men, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, and his book Avicenna and the Visionary Recital in the Bollingen series. And Avicenna was from Central Asia, not Iran proper. He was from the same area that the ancient Zarathustra was from, around Samarkand. And Ibn Arabi was from Andalusia, from Murcia, very close to Cordoba, Seville in Andalusia. And so Corbin stretched from Zarathustran origins in Central Asia all the way to the furthest reach of Islam in Spain, and saw that this was a scalar of immense reach and refined depth. And so presented the fact that we have misunderstood completely. And if one looks at Ibn Arabi, looks at Andalusia, it is also the home of Moses Maimonides originally, born about 30 years before Ibn Arabi, born in 1135. And he was able, Maimonides was able to take himself out of the increasing encroachment of vicious attacks and criticism by Christians in Spain, who were getting rid of the Muslims, and now we're going to get rid of the Jews as well, and moved his people to a place of safety, to Egypt, where he was welcomed by the same Sultan who welcomed Saint Francis of Assisi, and saw that this was a wise man and provided Muslim shipping to take Saint Francis back to Italy, welcomed Maimonides from Spain and made a place of honor for him there. All of this is contemporaneous with the development of Heloise and Abelard at the convent of the Paraclete in France, near Troyes, where in 1165, when Ibn Arabi was born, Chrétien de Troyes, the Christian of Troyes, first published his Arthurian 5-person visionary epic. Next week, in the presentation, we will take a look at how Ibn Arabi, Maimonides, Abelard, and Heloise, all of this has to do with the way in which Mary Magdalene, not only the companion, not the wife, the companion in a cosmos complementarity, was fertile by visionary direction. The last assignment from the cross is not, Father, why have thou forsaken me, but saying to her, behold your son, and saying to the young man, John, who's about 12 years old, behold your mother. The spiritual adoption by Mary Magdalene of young John, who became Saint John. And she took him to Ephesus. He's the one that had her entombed in the cave of the seven sleepers in 57 AD, and standing alongside of him when this happened was Apollos of Alexandria, the inheritor of the community of Philo of Jesus in Alexandria. And all of this was understood by Muslim mysticism and Sufism and completely ignored by the West to this day. More next week.